greetings, everyone. My name is Ramsey Baghdadi. I'm an editor with the RPM Report and co-founder of a health policy and regulatory venture called Provision Policy. First, I really wanted to thank the Personalized Medicine Coalition, the American Association for Cancer Research, and Feinstein Keen Health for putting together this very important conference. I actually think the timing for this conference is excellent, as all of Washington right now is thinking about health policy and advancing drug development and research during the current legislative cycle, and then, of course, the Supreme Court's doing a little work as well.
Let's hope.
Yeah, we hope. So we're living in interesting times in cancer where there seems to be cutting-edge work in the science with personalized medicine approvals reaching the market along with really important diagnostic tools. Regulators, researchers, and drug developers are really thinking hard about new and innovative approval pathways that attempt to prioritize novel science and get those therapies to market as quickly as possible. At the same time, while all this is going on, we have patient advocacy and participation that are really taking on a more important and direct role in the drug development process. And so really we have this intersection between science, policy, and the patient, and it's as pronounced as I think I've ever seen it. And during our panel, we're going to talk about that intersection and exploring the emerging models of cancer care and research and the implications for policymakers and the cancer community as they work to build and sustain progress in the fight against cancer. So we have a great opening panel today that aims to give perspectives on new models from the points of view of the researcher, the patient, the drug developer, and the policy expert. And some of you on this panel, or all of you on this panel, could do all of those things. I think what's unique about this group is not only have the individuals on it been at the forefront of thinking about new ways to learn and find solutions to the various diseases in oncology, but they're also implementing those new ideas, which is really the hardest part, as I think they would tell you that. First, we have Dr. Laura Esserman, who's a leading breast cancer surgeon and researcher with the UCSF Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center and director of the Carol Franc Buck Breast Care Center. She's also principal investigator on the innovative I-SPY2 clinical trial. And one side note, I was reading an interview with Dr. Esserman from the San Francisco Chronicle from last year, and she was asked whether she had any special talents. And she answered that she can barbecue anything. So, I was envious of that because I'm lousy with a grill. So, next we have Kathy Giusti, a renowned research advocate who's founder and CEO of the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. Two of the hallmarks of her foundation are an integrated clinical network of academic centers that collaboratively conduct early-stage clinical trials, as well as a state-of-the-art tissue bank that has advanced the science in that area and provides a foundation for the organization's pursuit of personalized medicine. And I've really heard many advocacy groups cite Kathy's foundation as really the model for what they want to become. Then we have Christi Shaw, who's head of the North American region for Novartis Oncology. In that role, she oversees all commercial operations for the oncology unit in the US and Canada. She has over 20 years of diverse experience in the industry across multiple different functions, including devices, and that gives her a unique point of view when it comes to the oncology setting. She's a member of Novartis' Oncology Executive Coordinating Committee and Commercial Operations Committee. And Christi's really going to help frame the discussion from the point of view of the drug developer. And finally, we have Dr. Len Lichtenfeld, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for the American Cancer Society. He's responsible for directing the Society's Cancer Control Science Department, which is a group of internationally recognized experts focused on the prevention and early detection of cancer, as well as the emerging science and trends in cancer. And that department is responsible for producing the Society's widely recognized guidelines for the prevention and early detection of cancer. And I should also add that he writes a fantastic blog called Dr. Len's Blog. I find it to be really honest and insightful, and he's also a highly skilled tweeter. And so you should check out his Twitter feed at Dr. Len. So with that, I just want to open, the title of our session is Innovative Models Addressing the Evolving Challenges in Cancer Research and Care. And so I just want to open with the panel. Maybe you can start, Dr. Esserman. What types of models are emerging, and what kinds of programs are each of you working on? Maybe you want to start.
So we're working on the I-SPY2 trial, and I think the motivation for that really was to think about how to identify the people most at risk for dying, but to do it early at a time when they're still curable. We know that, for example, in the metastatic setting, while we have had many drugs that have come on the market that have enabled us to control disease for longer, we're not able to cure patients. And when those drugs are then moved to the adjuvant setting or earlier on in the course of care, we actually are able to make a much bigger difference in survival. So why not identify those high-risk patients early and start getting the targeted agents out soon? So the trick is identifying patients, coming up with standards so that people can work together to learn and accrue. And we spent many years in the cooperative groups trying to get the standards organized in the I-SPY-1 trial, and when we really wanted to do something kind of innovative and out of the box, I turned to Anna Barker, who I must say was a great enabler of all of this. And what we did was we tried to set up a model. There's several things that I think are really important if you think about the way you organize it. I think is a model for trying to do adaptive trials. I think what you want to do is anticipate how you'd like to practice in the personalized era. So you want to think about how do you organize care so that you learn most efficiently. I can say, for example, as a surgeon, if someone shows up with disease and their risk is from dying of that disease because it's somewhere going to show up somewhere else in their body, what I do surgically is going to make no difference. It's in the way if I operate first. But in fact, I can, you can tell the surgeons they can be heroes if they wait and learn how, don't take the biomarker out. That's your tumor, right? So the idea is to try and think about how to organize care so the biomarkers are collected in the course of care and that you speed up the learning. So if the major problem is that if all diseases like breast cancer are now going to be orphan diseases because it's 5, 10, 15 different diseases, we have to figure out how to learn quickly and in the course of care. We can't afford to have 1 or 2 drugs come on the market every 10 to 15 years with that kind of a knowledge turn at $1 to $2 billion a piece. So you have to figure out how do you organize yourself so you can learn in the course of care. So you collect your biomarkers, use biomarker and imaging guidance, and you want to learn in such a way that each patient you treat informs the conduct of care for the next patient. That basically is the essence of adaptive design. And what you really need for this construct is you need a set of tools that don't quite exist, but we're developing in the I-SPY trial. Sort of the processes that really support the trial. An engine for adaptive design, an IT infrastructure that allows you not to look institution by institution, but over the course of the trials. We currently have 19 sites participating in I-SPY-2. It's a neoadjuvant phase 2 screening trial, hopefully for first ever phase 2 agents, mostly for phase 2 ever agents. We've actually randomized over 200 patients very successfully. And I think that you also have to have this IT infrastructure. We worked with CA Big to take a lot of the tools they had. CA Integrator is our database that allows access to, that enables us to provide a place to integrate all the data and allow access 6 months after the drugs graduate, to the entire scientific community. And then I think the third thing to think about in trying to make these models work is to say that, what do you need? You need alignment. So you need an alignment. So we need pre-competitive collaboration. That's what this model is. Everybody's got, at least 5 or 10 companies have the same pipeline of drugs. So why shouldn't the industry can learn effectively from industry? I think in pre-competitive collaborations, I think the return on investment is something like 3 to 1. For every dollar you put in, you get $3 back. Everyone will learn faster. As you start compressing the timelines, you're going to start to see the people competing on time to market, which is really what patients want, what we should want as researchers. I think we need to think about linked phases of trials. You go from phase 1 to phase 2 to a phase 3 where you can do a confirmatory trial. And I think you saw recently we've been working very hard to change the regulatory guidance. The FDA was really interested in 3 things. One is they wanted big winners, and I think that's a very key message. Second, they wanted more pre-competitive collaboration, and what we said was if you make a regulatory path forward for early approval or accelerated approval in the neoadjuvant adjuvant setting, you'll see a big change. And that, in fact, is, we worked very hard on defining what that model, a number of different ways that model could happen, and that just happened. So they just issued draft guidance, and I think that's going to be just a very big game changer. And finally, I would just say that at the center of all this is the patients. We work very closely with our advocates. We, have about 100 different investigators working together, but this is the kind of thing that patients expect and want us to do. So we just need to get to it. A lot of things to learn along the way, but I think that's the essence of the...
Before we move on to Kathy, I just had a quick follow-up. Was it a big challenge to get the companies involved, different companies early on involved, or?
No.
But no.
No, I think at the beginning, of course, it's a big challenge. But I think it just took leadership of 2 or 3 companies to step forward and say, this is important. If that guy's IGFR inhibitor is ahead of mine, and if theirs works, I know I'm going to develop mine. And I think what we're trying to, and we're also trying to stop the kind of thing where you get a very promising preclinical pathway, and 4 phase 2 trials down, you don't see any impact. And at the end of the day, you have no idea whether your drug didn't work because the pathway was wrong or because you didn't hit your target. But I think in the course of doing the trial so that you can get that second, you get an early biopsy and you can get the tissue, at the end of the day, you have a pathway forward if the drug succeeds, accelerated approval, and you have a pathway to understand how you should change your strategy if the drug doesn't work by looking to see, did you hit your target or not? And I think people eventually saw, hey, this is compelling. Not only that, why should I set up my own infrastructure all myself? I mean, it's an illusion, I think, that owning all the data and having it all to yourself is going to give you a competitive advantage. I don't think that's true when time to market is then on the horizon. Now the time to market's on the horizon, you got to be quick. And if you've got an engine running and you just drop your drug in and you get all your biomarker data and you're all sharing the same common standard arm, that alone is 3-to-1 savings. And you don't have to set it all up. That's just churn. And the other thing you don't want to do is, why should every time you want to test a phase 2 drug, why should you set up a new trial? Just because that's sort of how we've organized our constructs for credit and various other things. It's just a waste of, that's just an organizational inefficiency. And, patients don't want that. We shouldn't tolerate it. We just need to move on. There's plenty of other ways to give people credit.
Go ahead, Kathy.
So my name is Kathy Giusti. I'm a myeloma patient, as well as the head of the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. And Laura and I were just in a meeting together in San Fran, and I just have so much admiration for her work. It's amazing. What you'll hear from us, and I think Laura just said this too, is when you look at collaboration, it's all about people. It's just picking the right partners to work with. So when we started the MMR in 1998, I was basically told I would live about 3 years with the disease. There really weren't any treatments in the pipeline. So our whole goal back then was to jumpstart research and try to bring the research community to the disease, because there's no funding and there's no attraction. And once we did that, we got the scientists working together, but we realized the system was not enabling the collaborative efforts we needed in an uncommon cancer. When you're that uncommon as we are in myeloma, you have to build that critical mass of centers working together. So fortunately for me, in myeloma, we had really great collaborators, many of whom are here today. When we decided to build our clinical network, and again, this comes back to, we weren't funding a clinical network, we weren't funding a grant, we were building our own clinical network. We were designing the model by which everybody would play, designing the memberships, designing the SOPs to bank their tissue, designing how we would pick which trials, how we would handle publications. All of that was in the membership agreement. And I'm very proud to say that the first 2 centers to sign into that clinical network were Bill Dalton, who's here today, and Ken Anderson, who's here today. And they were the first 2 in. Once you've got 2 in, the others start to follow. So now to get into our clinical network, and by the way, David Parkinson was one of the advisors on building this clinical network, and he's one of our speakers today too. But when you actually get people in, now it's an honor to be in the MMRC, our clinical network. We have a waiting list, and we decide who gets to come in, and we're not changing the membership agreement. It's, take it or leave it at this point, because it does work. Now, everybody is held accountable to metrics. If you do a great job, you get support at your center. If you don't do a great job, we have to ask you to leave. And that's just getting into the business savvy of how you try to keep everybody on the same page. So that clinical network did a beautiful job of also banking tissue. And we decided to build our own tissue bank. We didn't do bricks and mortar. We actually played off of Mayo Scottsdale's space, and that's where our tissue bank was held. Once we started banking enough tissue, and we realized we could get high quality tissue, and this was back in 2004, long before the TCGA and everything, we decided again to do a collaborative model on genomics. So at that point in time, we reached out to Todd Golub and Jeff Trent on a genomic sequencing initiative, and we put $10 million into that pot. And then I can tell you now that we were then the first working with them to be the first to sequence the myeloma genome. And all of that genomic work continues to move forward, and all of the data was placed out into a public portal that over 1,000 scientists are using at any one time to look at myeloma genomics. So now we said to ourselves, well, this is great. We have new drugs coming about all the time, which is phenomenal. We've built a community. We're sequencing the genome. We were very fortunate. We've had 4 drugs now approved by FDA since we started. A lot of great companies working with us. We have 2 at FDA right now, and we have 8 more in phase 3 clinical trials. But all the knowledge that we've generated has told us that, indeed, myeloma, like every other cancer, is incredibly heterogeneous, and it's at least 10 or 15 subtypes. So we tried meeting with all of our academic centers to say, how are we going to define high risk? How are we going to decide where we go from here? And I hate to say it, every academic center had their favorite treatment and their favorite way of looking at things, and basically we knew what we were going to end up with, which was a big hodgepodge of data that we weren't sure what we were going to do with. And of course, as was discussed earlier, everybody did really want to hold on to their data. It was hard to put it out there in the public domain. So we decided to take on a bold initiative called Compass, where we are getting the patient's tissue from the moment of diagnosis and before they've been treated. And we are following those patients for at least 5 years, but pretty much all the way to the end of life. We are doing whole genome sequencing on those patients. Whenever they have a relapse, we're also looking at them when they're in remission, and we're collecting all of their clinical data and all of their genomic data and following them longitudinally. It's a $40 million study on top of everything else that we fund in the world of myeloma, so it's not something to be taken lightly. But the joy of doing it is that now all of that data, and we had to force everybody giving up IP. If you wouldn't give up IP, we wouldn't bring you into Compass. And I have to say, we did go to the academic centers first. We had no luck. So we went to the community centers. As a matter of fact, we ended up in an agreement with US Oncology. They represent half the sites. Once the community centers started enrolling all the patients, and we could go back to academia and said, well, you can come in or not come in, but we are enrolling. I give WashU a lot of credit. WashU was the first center to sign on to the Compass study, and like Laura said, once one goes, they all start to go. What's the language, what they use, how they get it in? And so now we have over 45 sites in our Compass study enrolling patients really, really quite quickly. The data will go into the public domain. And then, as you discussed, of course, when you're doing a pre-competitive consortium, which we wanted to build with industry, Onyx and Millennium, those 2 CEOs, Tony Coles and Deborah Dunsire, first 2 to go. And now the other industry partners are starting to knock on the door and say, you know, we'd like to get a look at that data as well. Yeah. And I think just to end, what we are seeing, 10 years ago, we all used to, do these really pretty PowerPoint slides, and the patient's in the center, and the patient's in the center. We weren't in the center at all. I can tell you now, as a patient, you really do feel like this is an incredible time. I mean, you look at genomic sequencing, you look at electronic health records, you look at social networking, and I always tell this story, but when people Facebook me now, they Facebook me and say, hi, I'm a fellow translocation of 414. That's how they Facebook me. I mean, that tells you what's going to happen in the future, right? I mean, we are building a researcher portal to carry all of our data. We're also building an online community where all of our patients are going to come in and start to self-select. I have to be honest with you. I only care about people that have 414s. I want to know, what are they doing? How are they getting treated? And that's what's going to happen in that world. And we are all going to find each other. And we are going to find the drugs and the clinical trials. And we are going to bank our tissue. And we are going to raise our hands. Fortunately, in myeloma, it's a great disease to study because it's pretty easy to get our tissue through bone marrows. You don't have to do surgery. So we are going to see a huge shift, I believe, in terms of the role that the patient plays in all of this and the knowledge they're going to need to have to do it well.
Before we move on, I just want to follow up. You mentioned, you see 2 drugs at FDA. What do you feel when you see something go that far, progress that far to the FDA? What sort of goes through your mind when you've seen that kind of development go through the...
Well, I think for us, in myeloma, especially when I was diagnosed, I mean, the unmet medical need was alarming. To just be told there's absolutely nothing for you and you have 3 years to live. I give FDA a lot of credit for working with the myeloma field and trying to understand what unmet medical need now looks like. So I think FDA has been kind to us. I think they've been unbelievably supportive of one of those cancers that they care about. But I also think FDA has watched our every move. We go in to FDA at least twice a year. Not when they have a drug sitting there, but usually when we're developing our business plans. And we walk them through what we're doing in Compass. And I think from Rick and Ann Farrell, I think they look at how the myeloma community is trying to work together to answer these questions to better identify unmet medical need. It's like Laura's saying, if you start to break your disease down into subtypes, you're going to find new unmet medical need. And I think that's the focus that we all have to have right now. I mean, fingers crossed that both drugs that are sitting at FDA get through, because I have to be honest with you, even though we've made progress, this disease is still 100% fatal.
Dr. Lichtenfeld, go ahead.
Well, I'm the odd person out on this panel. The American Cancer Society doesn't run clinical trials. We don't actively support clinical trials. We have a different mission. I'm sitting next to 2 outstanding innovators who I admire tremendously. In fact, on the myeloma front, I've cited the myeloma model several times in a number of venues as being an absolute example of how when you make and I remember 10 years ago when you gave those lectures at NCCN and you would come in and give the pitch, how it can actually transform care. But we have some other considerations and some other concerns, and I've been listening to the conversation here today, and I have to share that I get a chance to literally go around the country. I get a chance to see medicine from a variety of vantage points, not just on the cancer side, but on the practical payment side. The American Cancer Society, I'm going to say something up front that may not fit into this, but I think it's still important. We cannot forget it when we talk about patients. We're talking about highly motivated, intelligent researchers. We're talking about highly motivated patients. We're talking about people who are absolutely committed. There's a big world out there, folks, of people who can't get in the front door. And I don't think in our conversations that we should forget that. And of course, the American Cancer Society believes very strongly that access to care piece is critically important. And how we develop, I spent the day yesterday in Boston where we were talking to cancer centers from around the New England area, how they're going to be able to mobilize themselves in such a way in order to give effective care, and how we can layer on it, how we can deal. And some of them are major academic centers, how they're going to be able to move clinical trials forward in the brave new world when we have when we have to really reevaluate not only the clinical trial process, but the number. The Institute of Medicine Genomics Conference, some of you may have been there, there were talks in cystic fibrosis, for example, about trials with an N of 1. We're going to move to Ns of 1 and Ns of 25, and we're going to have to figure out where these are and how we make that happen. So access to care, how we improve care and make a process of care is critically important. For many folks in this audience, I don't have to reiterate that one of the fundamental focuses of the American Cancer Society and the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network is making sure that there's adequate funding available for you to do the research you need to do. Because all of this, through private organizations like the myeloma folks, the melanoma folks, the groups have come together and been so effective. Having the money to support the research is so critically important, and that funding is in jeopardy. Personally and organizationally, we have a strong focus on young investigators. We always have out-of-the-box thinking, so to speak, to inform those new findings. And if we don't make those investments today, our research enterprise in it, I've been around a while, and I sit in awe. I really sit in awe. I've written this as well, so I'm not just saying it here. I sit in awe of the researchers who have devoted their careers to an idea, to a thought, to a process. And as you get older and you get greater, you realize, as Dr. Mendelsohn pointed out in his talk, It may be a 30 or 40-year process of consistent discovery. If we do not fund that research enterprise today, aside from the discoveries we will not make today, we will certainly pay the penalties 30 or 40 years from now. But the fundamental investments that we have made, and Dr. Foti made a comment that's in that white paper that really struck me because, again, it's something that I feel strongly about as well. Although we don't talk about the war on cancer, some of us don't like that terminology, we have invested 40 years of effort, and maybe the results weren't so visible to the public, but we were building an incredible infrastructure that has put us at a tipping point that we must grab that moment and move it forward, but we also cannot forget that our investments today will have payoffs 20, 30, 40 years from now, and that's important. And without belaboring, because obviously we've spent some time here in this particular question, one of the things that touches us and touches me personally is the whole information, and Dr. Mendelsohn touched on about health information technology. From my vantage point, and I will tell you right at the top, I'm a lousy scientist. I tried it when I was at NCI, didn't work, and I'm going to leave it to the folks in this room who are much better at it than I am. But I have a chance to look at science and sort of talk about it and think about it. We have a tsunami of information coming at us, and you mentioned it in your talk, Dr. Mendelsohn. Our ability to look at the informatics, not only from the science point of view and the signal-to-noise ratio, and trying to figure out how we're going to take that discovery and move it into the lab, into the clinic, and the interactions that some of you have been so successful at bridging. But we have to have that infrastructure to follow our patients. We need a national strategy in order to be able to say, this test is worthwhile or not worthwhile. We need an information strategy that will inform our ability to move process through to know whether or not we're successful. We need a flow of information, and we could perhaps talk more about that. And we do believe at the American Cancer Society that is critically important. So from our vantage point, the science is so critically important, but we can't forget that this is a rapidly changing world. And if we're going to be successful, we have to take our visions and mold it into practicality, mold it into success to deliver. And at the same time, again, I'm going to come back to, what Dr. Mendelsohn talked about, because it's, again, a topic that's sort of near and dear to me. You've been around a while. You've seen great things, many great things come, and many great things go. Last week at ASCO, there was a discussion about VEGF inhibitors 10 years later. I remember when 10,000 or 20 more doctors were sitting in the room cheering the VEGF data and colon cancer. HER2 worked. That was a great moment. But VEGF and colon cancer and the treatment of colon cancer, last week they may have had 200 docs in a room that were listening to the 10 years later, and it was great promises and unmet expectations. I don't think that's the case here, but here's the issue from where we sit. We have made incredible investments. We have come to a moment in time, as I said, a tipping point. We are facing barriers where people are becoming naysayers and saying it's Pharmageddon, E-Room's law, the reverse of Moore's law is becoming so expensive to develop a drug it's going to shut down the entire enterprise. We have so much information it's going to bog us down. We can't get it into the clinic because it's too complicated for the primary care physicians and even the medical oncologists to understand. We can take that tack and say, no, we can't. Or we can have the resolve, we have the will and the way, and frankly, the funding to move it forward. We're at the point where we're going to make those decisions that will tell where we are going to be 5, 10, 15, and even 20 and 30 years from now. Yeah. And I think it's critically important, and the American Cancer Society believes it's critically important, that we keep ourselves focused on the larger goal, the larger commitment to society, and the benefit for our patients, who ultimately are the key part of this entire process.
Christi, do you want to tell us about what Novartis, some of the focus of
Absolutely.
your programs?
I really appreciate your passion for this. It's interesting coming from the industry perspective. Novartis being a leader in oncology, it's really, and we talk about this a lot, it's our responsibility to work in partnership with the organizations, with the scientists, to ensure it's not just Novartis leading oncology, it goes as fast as we can develop a product, but it's all of us working together with the patient at the center, as we've heard. Really, Novartis's approach and our strategy is to really go at cancer as quickly as we can, just as we all here together are doing, and that's advancing the treatment and the care for cancer patients. And our strategy is really a three-pronged approach. First, it's targeted research. So it's enhancing our screening process to ensure we have compounds and combinations. In fact, we have a compound for almost all pathways that have been identified right now, and we've just made our cell line, tumor cell line encyclopedia available online from a transparency standpoint. Second, on targeted research is to really ensure that we are selecting the right patients for our trials so that we have the greatest likelihood of success. And so as you're targeting patients with the mutated pathway, as patients are getting more educated, we can do this. And the third piece of targeted research is about patients understanding the patient selection criteria, and then for the biomarkers and ultimately the companion diagnostic that goes along with that. So for example, for us, we have an example with our midostaurin, which is our PKC412 for AML patients. About 30% of patients have a mutated pathway of the FLT3 mutation pathway. And so as we look at that and couple that with a companion diagnostic, that will be our first filing to move forward with both. And so every single compound we have in exploratory development has a patient selection marker associated with it. The second piece that I talked about was in terms of working with the oncology community. If you look at what we have today, we have over 350 investigator-initiated studies in the U.S. alone. And that's the scientists in the community, the clinicians in the community, really working on their ideas, scientific proof, where do we think that this compound will work, and giving them the freedom to do that. Leading to, right now, over 200 clinical development studies worldwide that Novartis has today. A real example of that is our Bolero-2 study, where investigators saw some of the data coming out of TAMRAD at San Antonio Breast year before last and said Bolero-2 will be a success. The community quickly accrued into that trial, and that product in advanced breast cancer will come to market a year earlier because of that those partnerships. And the third piece is innovative solutions. For us, we know, especially as you go into rare diseases and targeted therapies, that there's not a lot of education out there. And so it's not about just bringing the product to market. We've got to bring the disease to the market in terms of the whole piece of it, the diagnostic, the molecule, the education that goes with that, access. There's not a lot of awareness from an access standpoint. Our patient assistance programs, a family of 4 making $115,000 a year can get the product for free, and they are eligible, and many patients don't know that. We give tens of millions of dollars to the Copay Foundation for those patients that are underinsured to ensure that they have access. And depending on the disease state, especially in some of these rare diseases, children are involved, caregivers, we actually have case managers, reimbursement experts helping to find the solution all around the patient so that it's not just about the compound. So in the end, trying as a leader in oncology, lead with leaders in oncology following the science to ensure that the patient is at the center and that we're all working together to accelerate treatment and extending the lives and quality of life for patients.
So, Christi, I just want to follow up on one thing. So, we saw 2 major personalized medicine approvals in oncology in 2011, and just this past week, FDA approved a drug, Perjeta, in combination with Herceptin for breast cancer. And so, that, to me, that was, three big personalized medicine approvals that have happened fairly recently. And I'm just curious, at a large company like Novartis, a broad company that goes across many disease areas, is personalized medicine ever a tough sell internally? Do you ever come up against resistance in that area, or how does it work? Or is it because it's oncology you really can focus on these things?
It's really not a big sell at Novartis. I think, this been personalized medicine is really an opportunity for us to be a leader in that space. And some examples of that, if you may have heard the announcement last week by Foundation Medicine that we're going to expand our collaboration with them. We first did a pilot it was an 18-month pilot, utilizing their molecular information platform in some of our phase 1, phase 2 studies. And based on the data that came out of that, it's now an essential part of all of our phase 1 and phase 2 studies to look at the genomic profiling of the tumor. and ensuring that that's incorporated, because we believe the more data and information that we have, the better able we are to treat cancer, obviously, and then more quickly bring those products to market. So it's not, at least in Novartis Oncology, we run totally separate of any other part of the pharma business at Novartis. We don't have to get approvals for the bureaucracy buster, if you will. We're able to move a lot faster.
Got it. I wanted to move back a little bit and talk about trials, and maybe Dr. Esserman, do we have the kind of clinical trial infrastructure that we need to collectively conduct and benefit from all the different kinds of research that's being done out there right now? I read the discussion paper as well, and there is a lot going on, and I'm just curious, there are a lot of the pieces, but are those pieces optimally connected to sort of maximize the output, in your opinion?
Definitely not, but I think that's opportunity. I think if your focus is to try and figure out how to get the right drug to the right patient at the right time and to do it now in the near future, then we're going to have to make some changes. And we've certainly made some of those changes. I think that, and I think, trials like I-SPY 2 they're not, we tried to build this not just as an example or just as an instance of a breast cancer phase 2 trial, but really as a foundation for change. I think that you'll see integrated into the platform is, a whole platform for companion diagnostics and how to develop those. That's led by Laura Manfier. I think also that Janet Woodcock's leadership in this has been really terrific and really trying to think about some mechanisms and tools to help think about how to organize trials, having a master IND for multiple drugs, from multiple companies. And actually now we have companies coming and say, hey, it's like Go Fish, do you have an IGFR inhibitor in the trial? Would they be interested in combining with our trial? That's the kind of thing that you want. And I think a lot of what made this work is thinking about being collaborative by design. So there's processes that you have to work on, and then I'm going to get to some other infrastructure in a second. But we sat down, the FDA was at the table to begin with. If we had sent this trial design to the FDA after we designed it, I think they would have rejected it because it didn't follow the rules. But we really asked to say, here, come help us solve this problem. And we came up with a lot of mechanisms. Janet Woodcock, great leadership, Bob Justice, Shavri Buckman, the whole group. I think that's really exciting. But I think if you stop and think about it, I think the real problem with the way we run trials is that they are a special effort. That research is something we do is this whole separate infrastructure. That just won't do. And I have to say, as a clinician, I completely agree with Dr. Lichtenfeld. I think that if as Len says, if research is some afterthought, how much of it are we going to do? But honestly, clinical care and research should be one integrated system. As a clinician, why is it okay for me to practice each time someone comes in? I should be informed by everything I've done up to this date. That is not how our systems work. We don't have any, all the IT systems are optimized and integrated and developed specifically for institutions, not for networks. It's not patient-centric. I will tell you, it does not maximize learning. We have a project called the Athena Breast Healthcare Network across the 5 UCs, and we're expanding to some other institutions with the idea that there's a common way of organizing information with the explicit intention of integrating clinical care and research. You collect data as you go. So just think about what it would take to change the nature of IT. Okay, so if you said, okay, and so just think about the implications of accelerated approval. Okay, now, this is my fantasy, of course, that but you collect 80% of your data from patients. They are the source. Why are you asking the physician when a patient had menopause? Or why? Surely the patient knows that best. And no one is more interested in their disease than the person who has it. They have plenty of time and interest to do that. We know that. We even know that we're doing this, with 150,000 women who are getting screened. They're very willing to give you that information. Then you should be thinking about, how do I automate risk assessment? How do I integrate each person? The new registries of today should be, what is the mission, not the stuff I need for billing, what is the mission critical data I need to take good care of this patient, that I collect it once. It becomes the registry. It becomes the You can verify it electronically. It drops into your clinical trials. It serves as your way of checking, you know, once a drug's on the market, what's the toxicity, what's the long-term efficacy. Imagine if you had accelerated approval. And now you need to conduct, you know, 1,000, 2,000 patients. Well, you know, anyone who wants access to that drug better figure out how to collect toxicity and outcomes. All of a sudden, you've got the driver to make people develop the kind of systems we really need to transform our cottage industry of medicine to something that is a healthcare learning system. So I think that is what we need. Physicians don't have to collect everything, but they have to collect the mission-critical data, and by the way, it should be a standard. I mean, honestly, you will hear the people who run the systems at their institution, oh, well, you can't document that outside because, you know, that's not verified information. So where does a whole patient report go? It goes as a scanned document that you can't even access. That's ridiculous. There should be a structured, I mean, Ken Bueto's been saying this for years. There's a whole bunch of people in this room who believe this. But you get, you know, an HL7 message. Here's the critical, mission-critical pieces of information. You send it out, it's accepted, and it's integrated. And you don't have to search for it. That's your record, right? That's what you want.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what you find, too, is that when you start putting these systems together, for example, when people say that we have a clinical network and it's academically driven, well, it was. There's still many academic centers in that clinical network. There's a lot of community centers as well. The whole reason that we decided to do Compass was so that we would have people looking at the data, and I do think that's the biggest problem is the data is going to be out there. How are you making sure that you've got teams of bioinformatic people and, you know, and great myeloma clinicians and other people looking at all of that data and making sure it's used wisely and used quickly. And if you need to go back and talk to a patient, believe me, that's not going to be a problem for us to do that. And we have about 1/2 of the myeloma families in our data system, so it's very easy for us to just communicate with them. But I think the joy of where we've gone now is we actually know which community centers are doing beautiful work. We know that now because they're doing the Compass study with us, they've done EAPs with us, and we've been tracking their metrics. So if you generate a hypothesis, and maybe it's on a subtype, maybe it's breaking down another trial, for us it's not hard to go back to 50 centers and know exactly who can accrue, and it's not hard for us to send one email out to say, by the way, this trial's opening. If you know this much about your disease, at least ask your doctor about it. And I think that transition is going to be huge.
And you just add then, you've got the data that you need, okay, and you drop it in because it's collected the way you need it in the first place. Everyone can participate in a trial. Clinical trials shouldn't be the exception. They should be the norm. They should be the rule. But we have to then make it so that it's feasible to do that. And that is a collective need. And everyone has the same need. You talk about Moore's Law. Moore's Law in medicine should be the collection of information and the use of it and how it generates new knowledge.
I just got to jump into this, but I'm sitting here just waving my hand saying I want to say something. And I don't even know where to start. And so I'm going to start with, that's the problem. You see all this stuff, you try to figure out where does it fit into this particular discussion. So let's start with this. Newsflash, folks. The cancer world is undergoing a major revolution in how we deliver care. You're going to hear more about that, I assume, in one of the following panels. And it will not be paid for. It will not be structured. The whole world is changing. I've been around this business a long time, so I've seen the change that didn't materialize. Maybe this time it will be different. Many people tell me it will. The reality is that a lot of the care that's currently being given at major cancer centers is going to be driven economically into community cancer centers. And that's a reality. When you hear the word ACO, think of people who are really going to be sitting there on the local level saying, no, you can't go over somewhere else. Now, I don't think that's real, and I think the cancer centers, as they have acknowledged publicly, are going to have to deal with their business models to try to figure out where they fit. That's not what we're here to talk about necessarily today. But the patients that you want to attract into these trials are now going to be in community practices. And Laura, I can't agree with you more. I sat in my office, and I call it the Lichtenfeld Index. I called it the state of information technology. And I started off at Neanderthal. Maybe Cro-Magnon would have been more appropriate back in the 1970s and 80s. And I think we're not really, and then infantile was the next level up, and I think we're maybe getting into infantile/juvenile. Now, all of you sitting out there in these great medical centers, and you say, oh, we've got, I won't mention the company's name because it's taking over the universe. We have this system, or we have that system, or we got another system. And the systems even internally can't even talk to each other. And I will tell you, I sat on a standards panel for oncology care. We couldn't even have a standard on how we get staging into a clinical oncology record. So the point you make is absolutely critical to advancing this agenda. If we do not find a way to make data patient-centric, accessible, searchable, and yes, drop it in the box, the way you're talking, and actionable, we are and folks, we're nowhere near that. Now some communities, health information exchange.
We could be.
I'm still an optimist too, okay?
Excellent.
And this is 30
We'll
years
talk.
later. We will talk. But I can't emphasize enough how much I agree that if we're going to have this enterprise, we're going to have to find the patients where they are, because you're going to have the translocations that identify a small number of patients. They will not be in your medical centers. They'll be in the community practice. And we need to make it work so that we can move this process forward.
And I'm sure Kathy would agree with me. The solution to all this, we talked about how the data is locked in silos, give the patient, get data back to the patients are going to release it. John Wilbanks, people like that, if we want big data and we want people to have access to the information, our patients will lead the way.
I have to tell you, too, from an industry standpoint, it was appalling to me to see the statistics in terms, a couple of things. One is, as you look at all patients accrued to clinical trials, 25% of them come from the U.S., over 50% of them come from Europe. That's true at Novartis, that's true, I think, across the industry. And terrible as I saw my mother die of metastatic breast cancer in Iowa, not getting this protocol to patient, as we like to call it at Novartis. How do we ensure that every patient has access? And then we look at where we are making progress, we think we are, and we run into this fragmentation of the U.S. and our inability to have standardized testing. So a great example is, we all know the Gleevec story with CML. The testing that we did in SND studies with Tasigna used international recognized standards for PCR testing. You go to Taiwan, guess what? There's one standard. Every patient gets it. They know what their numbers are. In the United States, depending on which lab you go to, which doctor you go to, your numbers are always different. So there's no standardization to be able to say, what does good look like? Because we kind of, to your point, have all of these small, everybody doing their own thing.
Right, and that's going to continue. I mean, even for us, as we build out our IT systems, which we've been, working with consultants and doing this for 18 months now, we're trying to build out IT systems where the front end is so easy, you feel like you're honestly shopping on Amazon. You're just kind of going, okay, here's the translocation, here's what I'm looking for. And then you're looking at all this information, but we're trying to make it honestly so that 3 years out, a patient can go on and use it. Because the odds are, in 3 years, they might be doing that. So while the data's open up to everybody in our study and will be on the public domain for everybody to use, and you have to bring in incentives to get everybody to use it, that's the way it's going to be. But we did have to build this, and it's yet another infrastructure that will be out there. And I think Bill Dalton talks about this all the time too. Is
Absolutely.
The frustration we have is in myeloma you do the sequencing, right, and all of a sudden we realize BRAF is a target for myeloma, and now you've got to figure out, so what do we do with that clinically? So one center is going to open up a myeloma BRAF study. I don't think that's going to work too well for 5% of myeloma patients. So how do you start to build out the clinical systems? And as Bill often says, just imagine we're all generating this data and we're all part of them all. And we realize that myeloma is going to be a little small specialty store, but right next to it's going to be melanoma with also a BRAF issue. And so how do you find the teams that are going to care enough not to be so tunnel vision on their own disease, but to go broader and realize that you have to build a larger infrastructure that we are all sharing the data.
And it is interesting to see how much of this is driven by educated consumers and demanding, wanting change. I think that certainly in my field in breast cancer, so much of the change came from patients demanding something more and better. And we actually supported the development in collaboration with NCI of breastcancertrials.org. And where did that come from? That came from a patient who was the CFO of Shutterfly who said, this is ridiculous. She kept herself alive for 10 years, finding HER2 trial after HER2 trial. And she wanted to develop a system where patients could put their information in and search for trials, which we now have figured out a way to code, over 600 breast cancer trials. You can search from them nationwide. But really, when you put your data on cancer.gov, the researchers should have to answer the 10 questions that makes matching an automated thing. Bill now has this big network where he's able to really match people to trials much better. This should be standard. But it shouldn't, again, it cannot be institution-centric. Some people have to stay local. Some people want to be able to travel. Let them find it and make it patient-friendly. And everything, again, if we think about who it's all for, we'll eventually do the right thing. I think that's an important driver.
So we got about 10 minutes left or so. I have one more question that I want to ask the panel about progressive approval, this idea of a new approval pathway. But if you could just, if you have some questions, start thinking about them right now, and then we'll get to them right after this. But there was a lot of buzz leading up to the user fee reauthorization about a new approval pathway of progressive approval, and the idea that you would, it's essentially with less evidence than you now have for accelerated approval maybe, but confirmatory program in place, includes risk management. It's very ill-defined right now, but it's going to come up again, and that's near certain. So I was just curious, this is for anyone on the panel, what would you like a progressive approval pathway to look like, or is this the right pathway to go down right now? Some of the ideas that have been out there.
Maybe actually, it's sort of interesting. I will share with you. I'm not sure I've seen specifically progressive approval, but you made a point. That's when I raised my hand. That I think is a lesson. We carry lessons of life with us, and I'm not a Luddite, but the things you learn. And one of the things I learned a long time that I've always kept within myself is in the old days, you could do a phase 1 clinical trial and with a small number of patients, and you could learn, if you were careful in how you evaluated those patients, there's so much that you could learn that would predict what was going to happen later on. Now, that was not always successful, I will admit that, but it's this whole issue, and I keep coming back to what I mentioned a while ago. If we're going to move this process forward with the types of information that we're going to have and have a viable business case to make that happen, we are going to have to change how we look at approvals. And we're going to have to have very high quality, intense observation of smaller numbers of patients to move them forward in a way. So I'm not speaking as an official position of the society. I'm speaking individually, I will say, informed individual perhaps. But I think that's so important. We are going to have to figure out a better way of getting this done, because otherwise we will have so many opportunities. Somebody mentioned a number of 1,000 targeted therapies. Did I hear that number floating around?
1,000 I heard earlier today.
Yes. Is that what you said?
Yes.
When you start talking numbers that today, only imagine what's going to be like. And this is an issue that actually has been discussed for. It's not brand new. It's been there have been articles written and talks about it, whatever. How do we make this happen? So I'm going to say, now, there's another side. I'll be quick about it. Having lived through, not lived through personally, but having observed the Avastin situation and the issues around accelerated approval, and people saying you were too loose with the data, you got it into the clinic too much, too quickly, and terrible, look at all the harms and the damages. And then frankly, one of the panelists, one of the ODAC panelists has said in 2 different places that I've heard personally, and by the way, it only produced a 3-month improvement in survival. And so setting a bar much, much higher. You know something, folks? We've got to figure out a better way.
I think the past, actually, sometimes you go back to the past when new things don't work. And we've actually had examples where a phase 1 early trial, if you know the science, you know the pathway, and you have a targeted combination, you go to proof of concept. In phase 1, I mean, working with the FDA, Afinitor is a great example. So you follow the mTOR pathway, which disease states is that relevant in. And we had a phase 2 28-patient trial in tuberous sclerosis complex, benign tumors in kids in the brain where they had nothing else but brain surgery as an option when they needed it. And they approved the product 6 months later. And then in April, we got TSC for AML, benign kidney tumors, 4.5 months. So you can do a phase 1, I think, if you know the science, follow the pathways. I think it's when you do the broad brush approach. I would hate to your question about getting a little bit efficacy and then going broader, because if it was, you can have better proof of concept today than what we had before. You don't have to settle for a little bit of efficacy.
When you have when you don't have good data, you need large numbers. But when you have very good data,
exactly.
you can use smaller. So let me give you the example of the new guidance on accelerated approval. And again, I actually wouldn't trash the FDA for accelerated approval on Avastin. The system.
I'm not trashing
No, but no, I'm just saying in general, people have. But I think, look, the system worked. They were trying to make it. They thought it looked good, and then they pulled it back. So here, I think what's really important, and we worked really hard to try and get this guidance as a pathway, and the FDA was very responsive to it. And in early breast cancer, it's not, when you use the neoadjuvant approach and you look for pathologic complete response, does the tumor respond? If you take all comers, it's really a mixed bag and it doesn't work. What we tried to show was if you take high-risk patients at risk for early recurrence, okay, high proliferative rates in ER positive or triple negative or HER2, if you look at that, you actually see big differences, like 45% differences in excellent responders versus not, like in the triple negatives. Is that a reasonable surrogate? It is a reasonable surrogate. And they actually put out accelerated approval in this setting. In the I-SPY trial, no one gets on the trial without an array. If they have biologically, high-risk disease based on a 70-gene FDA-approved test, they go on to the trial and get randomized. And so the point is we're targeting it, and we're looking for doubling of the log odds ratio of improvement, not a little bitty difference. We're not looking for a me too. We're looking for a screen that allows us to get the big winners out and not have an opportunity cost where you can't, where you're spending all your time on one drug and you can't get the other ones through. And they actually put out accelerated approval. They used the legislation they had, and they changed it. And great for them. And as we said in a meeting last week, I said they have done their part to get the data out there. Now we got to figure out how to release it just as soon as possible, so we do our part. And that actually I think is terrific. It's a terrific model of saying, look, you're not going to start with perfect. Start with the best you can, start using that, and as you learn that there's a better endpoint, flip that in.
I think what you're hearing, too, is that it's getting so complicated. We're lucky to be a trusted third party that kind of convenes everybody together. I think the challenge, and what Laura's done well, and what we've all tried to do well, is don't wait to bring FDA into your discussions. Be meeting with them all the time. But what you're hearing is when you try to build new models and build new plans, it takes an amazing amount of discipline in terms of your business savvy and writing those plans. It takes an amazing amount of discipline to know who your partners are. I mean, you can hear it today. You've got to understand who's doing the genomics, who are the community centers, which academic centers are going to have attorneys that can really work with us.
Trusted brokers. So
Trusted
you're a trusted broker.
exactly.
FNH Biomarker Consortium was a trusted broker.
And lots of partners
And a
keep going.
pre-competitive consortium means you don't do one deal, one person doesn't own everything. That's what it is. And then actually, once people get beyond that, I mean, Anna Barker said that's when we were developing it. She said, once people get started down this path, they're going to love it. So, like it.
Can I follow up on a comment? Because I think it's important for the people in the audience, particularly those in the advocacy community. If we're going to be successful in moving this forward, and this types of, perhaps surrogate markers may not be the best word, but developing new markers, developing new endpoints.
Companion diagnostics.
Whatever it may be, endpoints, disease endpoints, and we maintain accelerated approval, which again I want to emphasize. I think the FDA is right in doing that, and they've tried. It's up to the advocacy community, I believe, maybe others won't agree, to make sure the public understands what this is all about. We will have misses along the way. And the lessons from the Vioxx situation were that the public, particularly with a drug like Vioxx, was not going to, even though it turned out to be a class effect, was not going to accept in that situation a miss. Well, cancer obviously is a different disease, but the same principles apply. We need to have people understand that if we bring things to market, to benefit of patients sooner than might have otherwise been the case,
You may have some where you take
there's
back.
some that may not work. Second point I'd like to make, which has not been brought up in this discussion, and we don't have the time to get into it. One of the concerns that I have as we talk about personalized medicine, all the wonderful things going forward, is quality. and quality in laboratory testing and value in laboratory testing. We do not have a good track record, folks, in taking technologies that are highly academic, and even things like ER and PR used to be highly academic, done by one Nichols Institute a long time ago, and HER2. We do not have a good track record of infusing quality through all of our processes as we go forward in this arena. That may be more of a clinical issue than a research issue, but I would just, we've already run into some quality issues, as was mentioned earlier, with some clinical trials and application of information. The whole quality issue of how we test, what we do, who does it, who interprets it, who markets it, who sells it, what they're selling, and are they really selling something worthwhile, is going to be a very important part of how this whole process, you'll hear the next panel, I'm sure, I can name the people, I won't. We're going to say we need to show value if we're going to be able to pay for this.
Dr. Esserman has one quick comment, and then we'll go to one or two questions in the audience to be ready. Go ahead.
One thing about the draft guidance that I really like, this is draft guidance for accelerated approval for early breast cancer. It was just released about the Wednesday before ASCO last week. There was a New England Journal perspective with Tatiana Prowl and Rick Pazzer. But they were actually fairly flexible how they looked at it. If you know your biomarker, you can do one large neoadjuvant trial, and if you get 3-year follow-up, well, they'll decide that by the time they put out the full guidance, then you can get approval. Or if you're not quite sure of your biomarker, you do a screening trial, then you can do a confirmatory trial. So they left a lot of leeway, and they emphasized very much talk to them early and all the time. That to me is great progress. That's the kind of thing that we really want to look for.
Okay, question from the audience.
Thanks for an absolutely outstanding panel. I think the frustration for all of us is we probably could engage with all of you for hours on these points. I'm at the Georgia Health Sciences University Cancer Center, formerly at the National Cancer Institute, and before that at OncoMed. One question I have, and it relates to Dr. Lichtenfeld's point, and I apologize if I pronounced that wrong, is the whole issue of the patients who are not part. We're thankful for the advocates who have absolutely, the patients have moved all of this forward. We're much further along. But reaching populations like we have in Augusta, Georgia, populations that we have in rural North Carolina, how are we going to do that if we don't engage the public health professionals? So I have never been to a cancer conference where I really felt that there was inclusion, discussion with the health educators, the behavioral scientists. Yes, we do population science research at our cancer centers, but how are we going to really get in that line of patients who are not well educated, who have absolutely no idea what it means to talk about an advocacy group? In some communities, I'm sure in San Francisco, there's a much more engaged public health group, but I'm not seeing it, and I'm wondering what we can do to bring them into the equation.
Again, I think that you can think about the future as a different way that you engage patients. We're experimenting with these models of really going out there and seeing before you go in and see anyone, when you get a screening mammogram, you get used to filling in an iPad just like a paper and pencil. There's your beginning. You're part of it. We have this big education campaign to get out there. Again, I think the standard of care needs to be that you collect data in the process of care from your patients. Everyone's roles got to change, including every patient. And I can tell you that I can talk to anyone if you and communicate it. You can give. We did with a low literacy community. The iPad is your low literacy version. It's amazing how well it works. People take to that technology. If you are careful with your language and you make it simple and you give people back that information, you know, this is the beginning of it, and you get started. We have it in multiple languages, and we're working in different communities. So that's
Kathy,
the start.
I'm
We are actually, it's healthcare 2.0.
If you say that to the African American population in Augusta,
Yes.
clinical trials,
Yes.
and you say, I want your data.
No, not clinical trials. Here's clinical care. This is just
Okay,
clinical
but I'm
care.
just saying
So
there is,
that's the
we
start.
need as a community to recognize there are very different populations that cannot be addressed in this way. And if we don't work together on it, I just think they're being left out. We're leaving out our public health partners.
Yeah,
I
you're
think
exactly
it's a really
right.
good
Sorry.
point, and I think that part of it, again, goes back to working with the community, because I do think it is hard. When we even look out at all of our programs, and myeloma skews African American, you would be amazed that it does not look like the target when we're doing constant patient symposia and things. But we do work to provide, as much education as we can and put it in the most simple of terms.
That's where it starts.
But I think a lot of what's so amazing to me is if you just are in our system, you don't even have to do anything. We literally email you from the moment of diagnosis. You get an email of just this is what your disease is. This is what your treatment is. And we actually line it up. So day 5, you receive the first thing. Day 7, you receive the next thing. It does mean, however, and we don't want to be naive about this, they're not going to have iPads. And they're not going to have computers. And maybe they'll have a cell phone or, who knows. But you have to keep it so simple.
So when people come to the institution or someplace, they can go on iPad.
Yeah, they can go on there.
But increasingly, stuff's going to go on the phones.
On the phone.
And the amazing thing is the penetrance of phones is huge.
It is huge.
It's really huge, and across the world. And I think that's the way. The thing is, you start, and then the movement spreads. So you're right. We're not doing it perfectly, but we've got to do it right for some population. Figure out how to make it spread. But I think the capacity of phones and how they're changing, especially looking at that worldwide. It's really, really hard to serve African countries, for example. Even phones are very prevalent.
Dr. Lichtenfeld with the last word.
I have got to step into this because I'm obviously, I got to step into everything because I'm just telling you that they're terrific. But I live in Georgia. I live in a small rural town in South Georgia. I'm familiar with the Augusta community, and I'm familiar with the entire socioeconomic and ethnic issues that are involved here. You are absolutely, I'm going to disagree with my friends here. I'm going to say something a little different. You are absolutely on target. It is an issue we have not addressed. There is huge mistrust in that community. There is a huge, and frankly, the message you get is, I'm not giving the government any of my information. They want to take my genetic code and use it? It ain't going to happen because the same thing will happen to me that happened to Helen Lax. So let's put it on the table. Let's call it what it is. Let's address it. Let's discuss it. Let's promote it. NCI has a project in place, as you may know, where they're trying to look at how we can increase engagement in clinical trials, reaching out in the community. But the mistrust is deep, and it is going to impact our ability to do this. I had the opportunity yesterday to make some comments with regard to Robin Roberts, and she came forward and she talked about bone marrow transplant registries. That was her message in the time of her own personal need. She reached out and said, this is the message that I want to send. So yes, thank you, you're right. Let's face it, there's a lot of distrust in the community. We have a lot of work to do to rebuild that trust, and we certainly need to do it with regard to clinical trials. So thank you for saying
You're going to get the second to last word, apparently.
I knew I was
a quick last word, right?
You've got to get there. Where are we with 3% of women participate in clinical trials in this country for breast cancer? When we get that to 80%, I think the rest of the community is going to feel a whole lot more comfortable about participating. We just have to get started. That's it.
All right. And with that, please thank the panel. We'll move on.